Alright, this video is several months in the making, but I read a few books and want to share them. To give a little background, late last year, my roommate ditched me, went to Europe, and when he was leaving, he was getting rid of some of his possessions. Obviously, he can't take very much with him. And one thing among them was a box of books, and most of his books were stupid math shit that I don't give a fuck about. But he did ask me if I wanted to take a pass at them before he sent them off to charity, and when I looked at them, a couple of them jogged my memory because, as you know, after he got promoted by Digi, I got into Don Jolly, and throughout his videos, he refers to books pretty often, and I noticed there were a couple in there that he had actually brought up positively. More specifically, there was Dune, which he brought up talking about Star Wars in kind of a comparative fashion. And there was a Lovecraft compendium that had several of his stories. It mentioned Call of Cthulhu, but that's only one among many. And I decided to grab them, and both took me a really long time to get through, for a couple reasons. I am horrible about reading. I can only really read if I get up early in the morning, and it's literally the first thing I do, or if I'm just so burnt out on everything else that I have to read. I am fucking terrible. I've been trying to get better for a few years now. I did that one book video for no reason. But I did grab these, and even if I can't say I loved them overall, it was a very worthy experience for other reasons. On the whole, definitely worth reading them, even if I didn't love everything inside them. And I specifically didn't cover those books previously because I wanted to do this video. But just two books didn't seem like enough, and it seemed kind of lopsided with what it covers. So I decided I wanted to get something by Howard as well. And it's actually hard to know where to start with Howard, because his work is so fucking scattered to the winds. It's very piecemeal. A lot of it you can just find on the internet, but not in a form that's convenient to consume. I hate reading books on the fucking screen on the computer. So I just went for the Howard Collector, that book he did his video on. Actually, my favorite video that he ever did. I fucking love that video. Really captured a sentiment that's very near and dear to me. And over the course of the last few months, I finally got through the Howard Collector. So 3 books seems like enough to talk about. So we're just gonna go through these. First off, Dune. If you don't know, Dune is a classic sci-fi book from the 70s, written by Frank Herbert. Its cultural relevance has waned with mainstream sci-fi audiences, but the type of people who read old sci-fi books still hold it in very high regard. It's kind of become foundational in the direction science fiction has went since that time. And it is getting a new movie soon, so that'll be fun. The gist of Dune is that in the far, far future where technology has advanced immensely, although not computers for reasons that come up later, the galaxy is connected into this huge, gigantic network that has complex politics, aristocratic factions, many different layers of leadership that kind of glob onto each other and compete with each other. There's a guild that basically has a monopoly on trade, massive ships that control the flow of goods throughout this massive economy that spans thousands of planets. And really the defining feature of this society, or rather the mega society which encompasses the smaller societies within it, is the constant presence of competing realms of authority and interest, where the guild has its hand in everything, the emperor has its hand in everything, there is a back and forth between them, and there are just all these little subcultures that are unhappy with what's going on or complicating things, as far as I can tell at least. And this entire galactic civilization is united by spice, also called melange, which is this weird polymorphic chemical that just does strange shit in a very diverse, complex way. It's extremely addictive, but once you start eating it, your lifespan is extended, you kind of just develop the potential for powers. Throughout the universe of Dune, or the Duneverse as it's called, very mild superpowers are kind of common. There are entire classes of people like the Mentats and the Ben Gesserits, I think you say it. There's no one in Dune with super strength or who can shoot lightning, but various psychic, quasi-spiritual abilities are very common. Not very common, but these people are definitely around, and there are different classes and occupations that are basically predicated upon their existence. The term Dune is actually a slang term for the planet Arrakis, this gigantic proto-Tatooine, although I'm gonna get fucked for saying that by the Dune people, where everything is sandy, water is so scarce that without specialized equipment that collects it from the air and preserves it, it is literally incompatible with human life. There are very few forms of plant life, and the ecology is actually almost entirely built around these gigantic sandworms that can range from, I don't know, like elephant or whale length to the size of a city, basically. And at least at first glance, Arrakis is this shithole planet in the middle of nowhere where no one would want to live, but it just so happens to be the only source of spice in the entire galaxy, where they send out these huge mining ships, they collect as much spice as they can, and then they fuck off before the worms show up. This book is basically the trope codifier for the idea of a sandworm, so everything you associate with that trope shows up here. Footsteps, vibrations, any kind of electric thing. It's like tremors. If you make noise, they will eventually show up. Although in this depiction, they're so big you can see them from like 50 miles away. So they'll have a scout guy float above the mining rig, look out, he'll see a gigantic plume of sand, they know a worm's coming, and then everyone fucking flies away. The good guy characters is this noble house, the Atreides, I think is how you say their name. There's a duke named Leto. He has not a wife, it's actually a concubine, which happened for political purposes and no one is happy about, named Lady Jessica, and a son named Paul, who is the main character. They start out on a really lush, pretty planet. In my brain, I just reached for the Venetian planet that the fucking characters go to in Star Wars Episode 2. People have accused Lucas of ripping off Dune for a long time, and that just clicked in my head. But the Atreides start off on this really nice planet where it's grassy and all their people love them. Duke Leto commands a lot of respect. He's known as this patriarchal, noble man who his people can really trust him. He's a great guy. He has an inner circle who live in his compound, all colorful characters with these zany pasts that you can infer from their personalities. And they get a message from the Emperor telling them that, lucky them, they have been selected to rule a much more important planet. They're going to Arrakis. They get to sit at the heart of Imperial power, oversee the mining process for the spice, make a shitload of money probably in taxes, and they're going to be so important. Happy day for them. This is transparently seen by literally everyone involved as a trap. Again, the Empire has this insanely convoluted political situation where just everyone is kind of implicitly at everyone else's throats and constantly doing shit that they openly don't want to do. The Emperor is related to Leto, he likes Leto, but just the political situation leaves him vulnerable, so he wants to kill Leto for entirely pragmatic purposes that he himself really wouldn't defend if you put his feet to the fire. And the Atreides are the longtime rivals of this other house, the Harkonnens, who are so comically fucking evil that it's almost hard to imagine the movie not making them look kind of silly. Where the Duke Harkonnen literally is this morbidly obese guy who floats around on a device that uses lasers to suspend him and move him throughout the air, and he spends most of his time corrupting the people around him, singing weird, evil, effeminate, roundabout statements that imply that he's just this purely malicious person. And one of his favorite hobbies is having his personal guard drag twinks into his fucking bed chambers and drug them so he can go in and have his way with them, I guess. And he feels no need to hide this, he just does this openly in front of other people. Everyone in the Harkonnen circle is kind of a scumbag, it varies. The characters themselves bring up the fact that several of the people in the Harkonnen family probably would be decent people, or at least just reasonable people, if not for the fact that they're constantly being corrupted by the Baron, and they have to live in this insane dog-eat-dog world. There's a very open animosity, actually, where the Baron Harkonnen has this nephew, the guy who probably would have been a good guy if he had been raised in a different environment, and the nephew is openly trying to assassinate the Baron, and when these attempts fail, the Baron makes him do these weird, ironic, contrived punishments. It's actually a lot like the Rule of Two. I'm noticing shit now that I'm thinking about it. But the Baron is the worst guy ever, a comical, over-the-top villain, very smart, but a complete piece of shit. And Leto's whole position is he can either stay on his nice, lush, beautiful planet, where he will be openly defying the Emperor, or he can spring the trap on purpose, go immediately to Dune, but be so fucking proactive in how he acquires allies, builds up a base of operations, puts himself in a position of strength, and at that point, the only way to get rid of him would be to attack him with an open army, and because the Emperor does not want to fucking do that for, again, political reasons, he will hopefully choose not to. Again, there's this running theme of the duality of politics where literally no one falls for this. Every single character knows that the Emperor is full of shit, but just for reasons of political nicety, no one is allowed to address that consciously. And everyone in Dune who engages with Imperial politics lives in this weird fucking quantum space where there's one set of facts that are official, and there's one set of facts that are real. And even though literally nobody believes the bullshit political facts, it's just that the mechanisms of empire require it to function, so no one is ever honest about what's going on, even though the people telling the lie and the people receiving it both fucking know. Which, now that I say it, some very interesting parallels with our current situation, but we can get to that later. For the first sections of the book, basically the first half, maybe 2/3, the story is about Leto taking all his people, taking his family, going to Arrakis, and trying to establish a political order as fast as he possibly fucking can. Because he just needs enough bodies between him and the Emperor to make it not worth doing whatever the fuck's gonna happen. Important to this whole situation is Leto's wife, Lady Jessica. She is I don't know how to say this, but she's a Bene Gesserit. This is kind of hard to explain, but they are an order of female psychic eugenicists. They're sort of like the clergy of the Empire. They exist in a parallel power structure where they are scattered all throughout society. Whenever you're in a room of powerful people, many of the women will belong to Bene Gesserit. It's just understood that they have their own shit they do. The men of this world and the political leaders are not allowed to be privy to their fucking actions. They're basically space nuns, and a great number of prominent men have Bene Gesserits as wives. But their role is to be the genetic shepherds of this entire society, and their purpose is to always be working behind the scenes, influencing people to mate with each other, trying to pair people together who have traits they want to propagate. And they're playing the long game. They do this over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years, actually several thousand. It's not even trying to produce a certain type of child, it's trying to produce a certain type of child who can be paired with another, who can be paired with another, who can be paired with another, where you're basically trying to get a certain type of person into this world 500 years from now. They're very secretive, they also have vague psychic powers. To an extent, they can do the Jedi mind trick, they can trick people into doing stuff. I am finding that the more I think about Dune, the less I respect George Lucas. They do have powers, they're very vague, kinda weak. You couldn't have like an army of fucking Bene Gesserits, it wouldn't work. But they are very powerful as background political people. And one of their greatest weapons is actually cuckoldry. I said that the Bene Gesserits do marry, they're often partnered with very powerful men. These men just have an understanding that part of the deal is that at any time, their wife is liable to run off and have sex with just some random person, or even an enemy in some cases, for the purposes of getting pregnant and having a kid who might pass forward some genetic trait that will create the Messiah 10,000 years from now. That Messiah's name is let me look it up. Kwisatz Haderach, which is a male child who is going to be born with unique psychic sensitivities at some point during the history of this civilization, and one of the candidates is Paul Atreides, the son of Leto and his Bene Gesserit wife. Not wife, The Duke never married her because he wants other houses to think he might take a formal wife at one point so that they will be nice to him. This is an old fridging between the two where Jessica understands why he did it but is still unhappy about it because she's a woman. One of the very first scenes, Paul talks to some old Bene Gesserit lady. She gives him a little test. I think it's inconclusive, but he might be the Kwisatz Haderach. And we learn that he has been secretly trained from birth in the ways of the Mentat, which is another one of these classes of spice-enhanced people. They're basically spy masters. They hang around in political circles and use their enhanced sensitivities and special paranoia training to deflect threats, find traps, expose and destroy double agents, stuff like that. Everyone who's anyone in this universe has a Mentat by their side, just protecting their life. Being in politics without a Mentat is like being in a war zone without body armor. In a way, I'm about to get into spoilers, but not really. The thing about Dune is it spoils itself. It doesn't come up much, but the story is framed as a historical document that constantly implies what is about to happen. And half the characters are psychic. So everything that happens is a foregone conclusion, kind of. Leto takes his family and his inner circle to Arrakis. There are some very interesting scenes where Arrakis' internal economy is almost driven by water. Water is very much a currency there. Most people live in houses that have special moisture-retaining measures. Throwing dirty rags in the street is seen as a way to mock but also give charity to the poor because they'll grab them and suck the water out. And it is just a fucking given that if you are outside one of the civilized areas for any length of time, you will rapidly dehydrate and die because Arrakis is just that hot, that dry, that inhospitable. And that's not even getting to the worms, which will almost always eat you. Until very recently, Arrakis was overseen by the Harkonnens, so incredibly corrupt local government. All the local aristocrats and businessmen seem like douchebags, idiots, assholes. There is one dude who tries to get in with the Atreides by having his daughter fuck Paul, so he was kind of cool, but other than that, they're really just horrible, snobbish, useless people. And because Leto is a smart man, he realizes this, and he looks at the people around him and says, yeah, we need to have this under control, but the real power on Arrakis is the Fremen. Don't call them the Fremen. People will fuck you up, but the Fremen, they're obviously inspired by real desert people, kind of a combination of Arabs and Bedouin, I think. I don't have the knowledge, really. Where they are these badass wandering tribes of just insanely rugged desert people who navigate the exterior, unshielded areas of Arrakis, walking out in the sands where civilized people do not dare to go. And as far as we know, they live a very simple lifestyle compared to the people in the cities, but they are extremely talented at desert survival and making a living in this harsh environment. They have a thing they make called still suits, which are the grossest thing you've ever fucking heard of, which are these bizarre, nasty latex contraptions where you wear it as a skin-tight layer over your body, where the still suit covers every single piece of your flesh, including you have a special mask that you have to put on your nose. And it's specifically a problem with beginners to the skill suit that they need to learn how to clamp it over their nostrils properly because that can be a big fucking problem. The still suit collects spent air, urine, and feces, and of course sweat, processes them, and puts them in a little fucking straw that comes up your neck and then goes into your mouth that you constantly suck on. And if you know how to use a still suit correctly, you only lose like a drop or two of water a day. You still have to be worried about the sun, you still have to be worried about the worms, but as long as you have just a small amount of water, you're good for basically weeks. A fun detail I did like is there's a local merchant in the Arrakis home city. It might actually be the guy who sent his daughter after Paul, but he manufactures his own version of the still suit, and it is literally seen as an intelligence test among the local population where if you buy one of those guys' still suits instead of a Fremen still suit, you deserve to die and no one will have sympathy when you just turn into a crisp in the desert. The Fremen know what they're doing. If you ever leave the city, do what the Fremen do is the motto of Arrakis. Well, their actual local motto is polish comes from the city, wisdom comes from the desert. But hilariously, the city people just look more and more incompetent as it goes along. Again, spoilers don't really exist in this story, but Duke Leto shows up, immediately starts kicking ass, sends his people out to mine spice. He has his tough inner circle combat mercenary type dudes who are completely loyal to him, round up the local people. He's gaining contact with the Fremen. He has this plan to have a whole Fremen military unit that will be operational within a few months. He very correctly sees the Fremen as the people who can solve this situation for him, but ultimately it doesn't work. The Emperor was even more devious than Leto thought he would have been. Everything goes to hell. A couple of their inner circle die. Most of them are scattered into hiding. Paul and Jessica get taken away in a helicopter. And in my absolute least favorite scene in the whole book, they decide to break out the Jedi mind trick at this exact moment. They have Jessica act all flirty towards one of the people flying the helicopter who causes it to crash. And the way they did this really annoyed me because they should be fucking prepared for this. This society is ruled by psychics and people who know how to manipulate psychics. And for some reason they weren't prepared for this. But they escape into the desert, exactly like you would think. They meet up with some Fremen. The second part of the book I did not like nearly as much. It's really just them fucking around with the Fremen, and eventually the Fremen have the ability to solve their problem. I'm kind of underselling it, but the first half of the book, in my opinion, way stronger than the second half. The book starts a little bogged down in the world building, but it's a very steady ramp up where all these moving parts are introduced. There's this really tense situation where there's a lot of urgency. You have this group of really charming, likable characters. Well, not all of them, fuck Jessica, but for the most part, you feel for them, even the ones you can tell are going to break under pressure. But when the other shoe finally drops, and the thrust of the story reaches this really hard fever pitch, but then the intensity suddenly drops, and it just kind of stays stable for the entire rest of it, where unless you're really invested in what's going on at that point, it doesn't work. And part of the problem is this. Dune has these multiple big ideas in it, and they are not equal in how well they work. One idea in Dune that I loved so much, where even if you don't love Dune itself, which I can't really say I did, there's an idea and a feeling in Dune that we absolutely need. It's real, it's visceral, this is something that matters. And that was this. Herbert really sells you on the idea of the planet as an ecosystem, the people who live inside of it as being part of a larger whole, where there's this overarching motif of the idea that Arrakis could be a good place to live if it was properly cared for. The best character of the book is Liet Kynes, we'll call him Kynes, where he has a fancy title, but he is a planetary ecologist, basically. He has a long history of studying Arrakis as a whole, seeing how the worms synergize with other forms of life, the climate, the atmosphere. There's a scene where he talks about how it is very strange for a planet with Arrakis' qualities to have the atmospheric composition it has, and I wish there were 50 more conversations like that, but there weren't. And his characterization is that he came as a scientist, but he spent so much time with the Fremen that he basically became one of them. Kynes always has a still suit. He has very intense mannerisms and his opinions about how Arrakis should work. And he has this fiery passion for the idea that if we were willing to think in terms of centuries rather than years and lay the groundwork now, we could gradually transform Arrakis into a proper, thriving, complexified ecosystem that has diverse plant life, an ongoing healthy oxygen carbon dioxide cycle. Critically, the amount of moisture that was in the air would be at a level where moisture would actually cycle properly. Humans would be able to get to it without complex machines that pull it out of the air. And basically, you could live there without either a gigantic laser shield or a fucking still suit where you drink your own shit. And the fact that that idea of planetary ownership and a cultivational approach towards how the planet exists, and the fact that there's an obvious parallel where the Empire at large is this sprawling, complexified, chaotic place where if there was a unified organization there, it might be a stable, good place to live as well, but no. And how there's a symbiosis between the city part of Arrakis, which by the end you learn people who live at the base of operations for mining, that capital city, they are dramatically underestimating the extensiveness of Fremen culture and Fremen society, how big a role they play in the daily life of the planet. And there's an extremely compelling metaphor in there about how to approach politics, the planet, our environment, obviously, our surroundings, that really stuck with me. And even if I didn't love Dune as a story, I feel like there's a central idea there that needs to get out. One of the other big running patterns in Dune is politics, and that's done pretty well just because it's so interesting. You really feel for Leto, you really understand the complexity of his situation, the idea of how to navigate this bizarre, monstrously ornate web of political alliances is such a compelling problem. And there's just so many irons in the fire at once during the first half of the book that really grips you. The third big motif in Dune is spirituality, I would say, and that's really where it fails. Paul is not a great protagonist. Paul is no Luke Skywalker. He is a very different type of character. A lesser critic would be tempted to call Paul a Mary Sue because he has all these powers that show up. He manifests psychic training. He's been trained as a mentat from birth. As the story progresses, he starts awakening these latent abilities of his. He has visions of the future. He becomes this superhuman spiritual political leader who can unite the Fremen and has the ability to push the political order of the galaxy in a whole new direction. But I wouldn't call him a Mary Sue, and I'm fine with this because it's that type of story. Dune really feels not like a traditional hero story. It feels like I am reading an ancient religious text or a pop version of that kind of story, where this is not about a young man having an adventure. This is about the birth of a religious movement. This is about the beginnings of a civilization. This is an ancient epic, the conclusions of which laid the foundations for tens of thousands of generations of believers and descendants. That's what it feels like, and Paul works really well in that role. It doesn't make him a particularly interesting character. He's fine for what he is, but only because of the feel of the gist of where this story is pushing. And this transcendent spiritual intuition that runs through Dune is just not as well fleshed out as the other parts. Paul's main motivation is really one of restraint. where once he starts having these visions, he sees a future where he is the emperor. He lays waste to this political order. He sees him and all this fleet of ships where the remaining members of his father's inner circle are with him, riding shotgun. They're blasting across the galaxy, beating the fuck out of the Empire, waving a new banner, declaring a new order under which everyone will live. He calls it the Jihad, and his internal mantra is that he must stop the Jihad. Even as he awakens to his potential to be this mythic spiritual figure who is so compelling that he will just magnetically bring the Fremen leaders to him and unite them in an effort to reclaim Arrakis, even as that becomes imminent, his internal struggle is, I must avoid the Jihad. I must find a way to spin my visions of the future into a manifested reality that does not lay waste to this civilization. And the problem with that is this civilization fucking sucks. I honestly don't know why he cares. The Emperor murdered his father for petty political reasons. The favored right-hand house of the Emperor, apparently, is the Harkonnens, where this creepy, sadistic, floating rapist man cackles to himself about how he's forcing all his family members to be comically evil like him, as he puts everyone under his control through this nightmare hellscape of a dystopian government. It's heavily implied that it was completely normal, before the Atreides got to Arrakis, for the mining crews to just be kinda sent out to die, with the Harkonnens not giving a fuck as long as the spice came back, so they would make no real effort to reclaim their ships. They would just send out the trawlers, and if they came back, they came back. They didn't really care. There are weird cuckolding space nuns running around cheating on their husbands all the time for reasons of creating a fucking creepy messiah who can rule on a desert planet. And there are all these psychic spies, and there's so much tyranny. I just don't see what was so important about keeping Paul from overtaking the Empire, when it would be almost impossible not to be a better leader than the current person. By the end of it, Paul does manage to assert power in a way that minimizes death, but he's also this really hardcore guy by the end, where he does not care about killing people. He tries to avoid it, but if he has to, he will do it. It's not a problem for him. And Paul's actual spiritual revelations, there's really nothing there. I'm being a bit of a dick by saying this, but I get the impression that Herbert is really a nuts and bolts kind of guy. He's a person who enjoys crafting a really ornate world. He's very technical in his mentality. I think just the raw emotional energy of a serious spiritual experience don't really mean anything to him in the way it would to someone having it in Paul's situation. So that never really gets fleshed out. Paul just kind of fucks around with the Fremen for a while and has these visions, emerges as a charismatic leader, like a, well, not a great comparison, but like a Genghis Khan type dude who can unite the tribes and then attack civilization. To the extent that Dune really succeeds in its spiritualism, it's in this organic, life-based, ecological spiritualism where you look out and wonder at the unity of the planet. And there it works very well, but in Paul's development, it's just kind of flat in one note and not that interesting to me. Arrakis, the planet, is the star of this story, and the Fremen are the star of Arrakis. They are super interesting, but they're interesting from a distance. I really appreciate the idea of what they are, but if I had to be around them in real life, they would kind of piss me off. The Fremen are cool in that they're super hardcore. They'll kill themselves in a heartbeat to protect their kind from an encroaching enemy. They don't give a fuck. They'll defend the people they're loyal to the death. They have this street smart, fucking brutal ability to survive in the harshest landscape imaginable. And that's cool, but they're also backwards in a way that does get a little old at times. If they think anyone's going to find out their secrets, they're really cavalier about killing them. They're pretty careless about it. As far as the Fremen are concerned, the city is the place for the non-Fremen. If you leave there and run into a Fremen, fucking whatever happens, get fucked. And they can't help this. The way they live is kinda gross. You learn later on, the Fremen are actually really good at providing little comforts and luxuries to their people within their bases of operation. Their sieges, I think they're called. Where the Fremen go into a compound, they close a hermetically sealed door behind them. Then they take their suits off and they're allowed to mill around and act like real people. And these places are described as being very comfortable, having a bunch of spice-infused foods inside them. All their eyes are blue because of it. They actually lead a very charmed existence when they're in their home territory, but as a byproduct of living in these hermetically sealed tanks, humidity and just body odor are a constant fucking reality of the Fremen lifestyle, and that's just kind of gross. And that kind of sums up the Fremen in general. The idea of them is awesome, but being around them is kind of gross. They also have these aggressively impractical traditions, where Fremen life is governed by this brutal honor system, which actually leads to one of the funniest scenes. Right when Paul gets with the Fremen, some guy is just being an asshole, and for reasons of custom, Paul has to take a fucking duel, ends up killing the dude. And because Paul kills this guy, he ends up with 2 sons who are like 5 years younger than him. Paul is 15, and these kids who are like 7 and 9 end up being his honorary sons because he killed their dad because the dad challenged him to a duel for literally no reason. He was just, Fremen are just dicks sometimes. He also gets a slave because the kids had a mother who he could have taken as a wife, but he chooses to keep her as a slave. And the climax of Paul's arc of getting in with the Fremen and eventually finding a force that can just, resolve the conflict relatively easily when the time comes, is that in order to become leader of his siege, he has to kill the current leader in a fucking duel. And the current leader is this guy named Stilgar. He's the fucking best guy ever. He's this aged badass of the Fremen who is super experienced, holds incredible respect among the Fremen at large, is an incredible reservoir of tactical knowledge, experience. He knows how to get things done. Easily the most useful person on the fucking planet for what Paul wants to accomplish. But all the Fremen are just kind of standing around with their arms crossed going, "We're not gonna fucking listen to you, Paul. You didn't kill Stilgar yet. Shut the fuck up." And Paul's way of resolving this is there's a big ceremony, which I think people came to thinking it would be a duel, where Paul just kind of turns to the crowd, and in slightly different words, he just yells, "This tradition is really fucking stupid." And he yells out a few more statements to this effect, and the raving crowd who were there for blood just kind of start nodding their heads and realizing, yeah, killing our leaders for no reason is kind of stupid, Paul. You're the leader now. You don't have to kill Stilgar. Let's go get the Emperor. And that's how they resolved that. And just compared to the first half of the book, having Paul just kind of stand on a stage and loudly explain to people that killing the most valuable people in your community is probably not the best way to not even resolve conflict, just to pass on leadership. It just wasn't so good in comparison. And unfortunately for the second half of the book, most of the best characters are either dead or in hiding. You really just spend a lot of time with Paul, his mother, and various Fremen who don't have that much personality. They all kind of have the same personality. It's just some of them are weirdly aggressive for no reason. It's really hard to pin my feelings on Dune as a whole down, because like I said, the story is only really there in the first half of the book. And Dune really exists, I think, as a vehicle for world building. And some of it is very good, but it did kind of get weighed down at times. Where early on, you just get these things used without real explanation of what they are, and they get chained together in a way where it just becomes frustrating, where one of the first scenes is Paul is told, "Oh, Paul, you were a mentat, and you're going to be tested by the Grand Madam of the Ben Gesserit Order, where they're going to put your hand in the Dom Jobber and see if you're a Kwisatz Haderach," and it's just, shut the fuck up, Dune. And it's weird to even suggest this, but I just wish there had been kind of an info dump at the front of the book just to get me up with the basics. And this is the weird thing. Several of the basics are not covered by the end of the fucking book. One thing about Dune that is very strange is when you're reading it, it doesn't really feel like a complete book so much. You get to the halfway mark, you get to the climax, and it does feel like the halfway mark of a complete book. But once you get to the actual end, it feels like the halfway mark of a much larger book or of a 2-part story. And this book did have sequels. They are very, very controversial. But basically everyone says the first 2 or 3 are very solid and do go together in a way where you really should read all of them. After Herbert died, this spiraled out of control into a crazy fucking expanded universe that many people don't like, but those first ones are kind of a set. And it was frustrating that when I looked Dune up after reading it, I learned all this crazy shit where apparently the reason psychics and people with powers are running all over the place is this world had this ancient robot war where AIs that were fully fleshed out turned on humans and the humans finally suppressed them, but they were so terrified of it happening again that anything resembling artificial technology was brutally suppressed. So computers are very limited in this world, but once they had found spice, they found that they could compensate for the lack of computers by creating human beings that had such powerful minds and specialized data processing abilities that they could actually make up for the lack of computers with just how smart and technically capable some humans were. And this also led to the creation of the Mentats and the Ben Gesserits and all this stuff. And my reaction was, holy shit, that is so fucking interesting. Why wasn't it in the book? Because you could piece part of that together, but it's never really explained all that well. And I understand not wanting to coddle the readers, but you make it to the end of the actual book and this shit doesn't get brought up. Although in general, the world building does have a bunch of nice little touches. One thing I really liked is they kind of limited the technology. There are lasers in this world and there are laser shields, but one thing that's kind of funny is if a laser hits a shield, they will link together and the vibrations will get out of control. And there will be an explosion, but there's a huge random factor to it. So an explosion could be so small and contained that it just kind of knocks your gun out of your hand. Or it could be so big that from space, you would confuse it for a nuclear bomb. And it helps to keep hand-to-hand combat as something that actually matters in this world because getting up close to someone and stabbing through their shield is a legitimate way of solving problems. Because if you use a laser gun, you might kill everyone within a 50-mile radius. Also, there's a major taboo against using atomic weaponry in this world. Again, really feeling the times, and that's a very 1970s environmentalist attitude. It feels slightly dated today, as many things do. Personally, I don't give a fuck, but several people have complained about the stereotypes of the Fremen, gender roles, things like that, but who cares? And speaking of that, that brings up my single biggest problem with this book, which is literally the last sentence, where there's a character who has been hinted at throughout the entire book, but has not showed up, and when she finally makes an appearance, it's at the very end, and the sympathetic characters fuck her over in the most unwarranted way, where it served a real purpose, but it also just completely destroys her life. And they talk about the fact that they're doing this with such a glib fucking tone that it really just felt kind of creepy. I seriously had a hard time enjoying the end of the book because it ends with such a jarring, cruel fuck you that I see no reason for whatsoever. Although right before that, we got a neat little world building detail about the sidekick of the Emperor, which that was nice. That was cool. All right, take a break. Let's get back to this. Second book, The Cthulhu Mythos and Other Weird Tales by H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft needs no introduction, one of the most famous writers, not quite a mainstream figure, but profound in his influence and citation by other people. I had kept hearing stuff about Lovecraft from Don Jolly and others that really sold me on the idea that he was an interesting person. I wanted to learn more about him, and kind of like I saw after this with Howard, hard to know where to start with him. Because a couple of his figures, like Cthulhu, were so popular, I had always assumed there was a core Lovecraft compendium. There was kind of a canon of Lovecraft, which everyone read, but his works are pretty horizontally laid out. There are one or two stories that seem very, very popular, but all of his stories are fairly short, and it seems kind of like you just have to grab a handful of Lovecraft stuff and start consuming it. And other than hitting a few of the classics, there's no real priority to it. The title of the book advertised that it had Call of Cthulhu in it, and I'd always assumed that story was a really big deal, but it didn't really stand out from the others in any way. I think it is the only story in the book where one of the massive otherworldly entities makes a direct appearance, but other than that, it was really just one of the stories. This book contained a couple dozen pieces. Maybe a third of them I just kind of found boring. Most of them were decent, not in a way that will really stick with me, but definitely worth reading. But there were a couple standouts, and there was one story in here that immediately became one of my favorites, to the point it actually became a part of my identity, which we will get to. God damn it, I keep almost calling the Dune guy Herbert Spencer, who in a very abstract way would be an actual connection. He was a philosopher in the late 1800s that was kind of a forerunner of what eventually became social Darwinism. If you study the history of American ideas, Spencer will come up, and because I have a degree in that, it keeps popping in my head. But he did not write Dune, that was Frank Herbert, and much like Frank Herbert, I think with Lovecraft, it's not really about the details. They could be kind of grueling in places, honestly. It's about his ability to communicate this core sentiment that is hard to get elsewhere and is just vitally necessary for our understanding of the world. And where Herbert came at you with this ecological understanding, Lovecraft is just so good at making you feel a sense of how little humans understand the world around them and how much deeper reality goes beyond our perceptions. And I am extremely fucking aware I am not the first person to notice this about Lovecraft. He is the progenitor of the concept of cosmic horror, and that's what that's predicated on. But in terms of what I got from his writing, being able to viscerally experience how he wove that into his work, it was a rewarding experience. And even if there were many places where Lovecraft's writing itself got kind of tiresome, I did feel a lot of respect for what he did and a sensation of, this is important. There is a lot of noise in this signal, but the signal really fucking matters. Also, one cool thing about Lovecraft is, even if he's not my favorite writer, talking about Lovecraft is one of the most fun things ever. Lovecraft is one of those people where it's worth it that he existed just because the derivative secondary material which branches off of him and comments on him is so fucking interesting. I had known about Lovecraft for a very long time, but the initial point of interest in actually pursuing him further was when Don Jolly was talking to Digi, and that conversation really cast him as a pair with Howard, and that's part of why I made sure I got a Howard book before I did this. And learning about the relationship those two had and contrasting them with each other, it's so interesting because I almost get the feeling that Lovecraft and Howard were kindred spirits in a weird way, where they took these really, really divergent attitudes towards the world, but I think there were different versions of the same response. Where I think you could take those two men, sit them down, and say the statement, humans do not understand the world around them, and both would emphatically fucking agree with you and corroborate that what you just said is a deep part of their understanding of themselves and their beliefs. It's just that with Howard, the emphasis is on humans. Humans don't understand the world around them. That's why we need an incredible skepticism for the people who run around trying to tell us how to live, trying to systematize our lives, trying to put us in these boxes that they created according to their own values, which are just founded in fucking ignorance. Where with Lovecraft, the emphasis is humans don't understand the world around them. In his case, it's not that this disconnect originates in our moral failings so much, it's just that what we're surrounded by and what we're up against is so massive and so complicated that the only real solution is to grab the people around us that we can kind of understand, hunker down, and pray the fucking God that the forces outside our control don't reach in and crush us. In that conversation with Digi, Don Jolly brought up this extended correspondence that these two men had, and in this book I got, there are a few letters between them which were interesting. But according to Don Jolly, they had this back and forth about the merits of civilization, which was Lovecraft, versus the crazy, primal foray into the wild, which was the spirit of Howard. And getting a closer look at how these two guys relate to each other, it gives me a real desire to dig into some of that material and explore it, because it seems like such an interesting fucking relationship. Where once you get to know them as creators a little bit, there's this incredible synergy and compatibility between them. It's like their worldviews aren't identical, but they rhyme. They complement each other in some weird way, where they look like opposites, but it's more of a symmetry. But as I was saying, to the extent that Lovecraft has a core message, it's that humans are surrounded by forces that they do not control, do not understand, and this difference is so huge that the very act of making contact with these forces or exploring them in any way basically consigns you to insanity and or death. Is that true? I sure fucking hope not, but I appreciate the sentiment, and again, humanity needs that message. Which actually slides right into the other thing that makes Lovecraft famous, which is his xenophobia and sometimes baffling levels of racism. Which, to be clear, would not preclude me from reading someone, but I was aware of this going in. And it was actually a very enlightening experience because black people and actual ethnic minorities definitely get the worst of this. But Lovecraft didn't just have a troubled view of people outside his race, it was outside his class, outside his regional upbringing, outside his language, outside the exact way he traces his family tree back to what he thinks are the dignified countries of origin. It was people outside his mannerisms and understanding of politeness. It wasn't just that Lovecraft was afraid of other races. Lovecraft was afraid of literally everything. The book has some supplementary materials that get into his background a bit, and it honestly seems like anything which did not imprint itself onto Lovecraft's actual childhood before the age of 6, 7, 8, around there, everything outside of that very narrow band remained incomprehensibly strange to him for the rest of his life, where essentially he had a very sheltered upbringing as a young child that kind of crumbled as he became an adult and his family situation changed. And he spent basically the entirety of his career trying to cling to a very narrow image of what a man is supposed to be and what a dignified lifestyle would look like, at a time when his actual resources fell horrendously short of what it would take to facilitate that. And he kind of spent his adult life not physically, but materially and emotionally on the run from what he did not understand. He just had a peculiar sort of sensitivity where the act of leaving his comfort zone at all was such an intense experience for him that it was essentially equivalent to being flung outside the world of human values and into the chaotic, dangerous, demonic unknown that lurks outside. It's very easy to criticize Lovecraft's values and who he was as a human being, and to an extent, he definitely fucking deserves it. But I think what made him special as a writer grew so directly out of his personal flaws that you kind of have to take him as a complete package, because I don't think you could cut out his bigotry without removing his sense of wonder and fear in the face of the infinite unknown. That said, I did not have a very good understanding of what Lovecraft was going to be. I thought there were going to be a bunch of epic stories about people going on crazy adventures where they perform rituals to summon demonic, otherworldly creatures, and people go the realms beyond comprehension and interact with evil, monstrous creatures that tear them apart and destroy their sanity. And to an extent that happened, but a lot of these stories are very intimate, very low-key, and very subtle in how they happen. More than one of these stories ends with the protagonist feeling very uncomfortable and fucked up with what happens, but more or less returning to their normal life, just kind of walking out into the darkness after witnessing something fucking terrifying and just trying to not think of the full implications of what just fucking happened. A slightly more annoying thing is that several of these stories end very abruptly with the protagonist just kind of dying in a way that isn't super set up. I wouldn't want to be too cynical. It would not surprise me if Lovecraft literally hit the word limit for some of his magazine deals while writing these, and made up for that by cutting the ending a bit short. Slightly disrespectful to say that, but I noticed with both Lovecraft and Howard, I really got the impression that the limitations of the medium was influencing their writing style. Many of the stories in both books were very, very short, if nothing else. But several of these stories end with the protagonist going, "Oh, something happened. It threatened my sanity. Oh, a bunch of stuff happened. I died." It's not always bad, but it's a pattern. The only stories that really fit my expectation of what Lovecraft was going to be would be maybe Call of Cthulhu, where they go to ancient ruins, open a vault, Cthulhu runs out. There's a very brief chase scene where Cthulhu doesn't really try to catch them that hard, and then everyone leaves. Call of Cthulhu also surprised me with how low-key it was, because it was very short and simple compared to what I was expecting. It was also fairly early in Lovecraft's career, which I didn't expect either. And the one that was most what I expected was The Shadow over Innsmouth. And if you hit up the forums, Shadow over Innsmouth seems to be one of his most popular stories. It's about a dude who wants to go to a shitty, small seaside town that no one goes to, and it's just understood that you don't go there, and if you do, you don't stay past sundown. He bums around and ignores obvious signs of how fucking creepy this place is. And that's another thing. Lovecraft's protagonists are really fucking stupid. Lovecraft's conception of a sympathetic person is someone who's basically him, so they tend to be very articulate and educated, but they just make the dumbest fucking decisions, and to an extent that's just a necessary conceit of the horror genre, but a lot of these people have no common fucking sense. But the main character in Shadow over Innsmouth, He bums around, talks to a homeless person who very, very dramatically screams the dark histories of the town towards him, suddenly disappears in a way that heavily implies he was murdered through nefarious supernatural means. And then, against all logic, Lovecraft's character goes back to the fucking hotel he was in, waits around for a while being paranoid, eventually hears people in the hall outside his door, sees a mob forming, goes down to the street, realizes that the hobo was not kidding about this town being populated by fish people, and eventually escapes, partially by looking at the fish people, seeing how they walk, and mimicking their weird lumbering gait as he slowly weaves his way out of the city. With, of course, a dramatic reveal at the end, which is very in line with Lovecraft's thinking. And I do love that scene because it really captures what Lovecraft is to me, where the protagonist is in deep, deep danger because he is in the heart of enemy territory. He is surrounded by people so different from him that he could not possibly reach any sort of understanding with them. But even in the midst of this insane supernatural power disparity, Lovecraft still kind of believes that he's smarter than everyone else and that he could literally just limp and hunch his back and the fish people would fall for it. And then once he reaches the outskirts of the city, he's fine. He can just fucking escape back to where the non-fish people are. And then when he's home, all right, we're good. And there is an ending after what I said that kind of invalidates that. But it's just such an encapsulation of the bizarre contradiction of how Lovecraft looks at the world. The attitude of, I am surrounded by demonic forces, armies of the unnatural, and incomprehensibly evil, godlike entities that can bend the fabric of reality. Thank God I'm a shrimpy white guy who lives in New England. No one can get me here. And to an extent, I'm being unfair by saying that, but I think even Lovecraft's biggest fans would have to admit there's something deeply silly about his existence in general and how he looked at the world. Insightful and necessary, but ultimately silly. Speaking of action scenes, that's a really funny thing about Lovecraft, is just because of the times at which he lived, there was a very narrow conception of what fighting looked like, what an action scene looked like, what two roughly human-shaped beings would do if they were in the vicinity of each other and one was alien or supernatural. And because Lovecraft had such a grounded view of how conflicts would play out, at least in physical terms, this interacts with the power disparity in a really weird way, where some of his action scenes just come across as kind of silly. The absolute best example of that, which one of the better stories actually, was The Whisperer in the Darkness, which is strange in several ways. But the core conceit is that the main character is in a correspondence with someone who lives out in the woods somewhere, I assume in New England, where he is being visited nightly by extraterrestrial beings. And these vaguely humanoid creatures, which I think can fly, they keep showing up around his house, his dogs bark nightly, gradually they get more and more bold, and it breaks into outright conflict. But Lovecraft's concept of how combat would play out is so human-based and intimate, where this dude, who is just a normal human being living out in a cabin in the middle of the woods, is fighting creatures that can put brains in jars, operate humanoid mech creatures, travel through space, and have some kind of psychic power. He is fighting these things by running around outside his house with a rifle, while surrounded by a group of hound dogs that run around him barking trying to find the things. And he's just standing in the middle of this confusion, occasionally shooting, and eventually did hit one of them because he found a splattering of weird discolored blood the next morning. And this situation continues for I think weeks on end, where he's literally going to the town every few days to the local kennels and buying more hound dogs to replace ones that were killed in the previous scuffle last night. And I don't know if this was intentional, but this was just the funniest situation where this is a farce. This dude is engaging in a nonsensical attempt to fight off an alien invasion by buying and sacrificing hound dogs and also shooting randomly in the darkness, and he is succeeding. And by the way, this story is also the literal worst example of Lovecraft's heroes being fucking idiots, because most of the story is framed as a correspondence between the main character, who lives safely in another location, and the dude in the cabin who is a friend of his. And not only does the dude in the cabin consistently refuse to leave his house despite the fact that he is shooting aliens on a nightly basis, But the protagonist actually receives a series of escalatingly desperate letters talking about the despair of the situation and how sure he is that any night now the aliens are going to finally beat him, until he suddenly gets a letter that says, "This was a big misunderstanding. I actually had a conversation with the aliens. They're wonderful people. They're nice. They're not holding a grudge at all. They have all these great things they want to share with the human race. They would actually really like to meet you. So why don't you get on a train, come up to my old cabin, we'll have a chat with the aliens. It'll be a grand old time for all involved." And he fucking goes. And I don't know how to emotionally respond to that. I'll also point out, I think I've noticed a little correlation. This is a very wispy thought, I'm not committed to this. But as I've said, whenever someone shows up in a story who is clearly a member of a group that Lovecraft would not feel kinship with or not understand, they are generally displayed in a very non-flattering light. But I think there's a bit of a correlation between how sympathetically those people are portrayed and the overall quality of Lovecraft's story. I noticed with The Shadow over Innsmouth, the alcoholic hobo who explains everything to the main character, he's pretty sympathetic, and that's one of his most popular stories. The fish people are also more sympathetic by the end as well. Another example would be The Color Out of Space. One of his better stories, I would definitely say, recently got a movie adaptation. I doubt it was good. And the whole story is about a working class family getting fucked up by space, goo, low-class farmer people, portrayed very sympathetically, and that's not that far from Lovecraft, but for him it was probably a pretty big deal. And before I tie up, one thing about Lovecraft that really distinguishes him and also makes him fucking impenetrable at times is his fucking writing style is so flowery and indirect, where I was just tempted to bring up Emerson as an example, but literally no one is as bad as Emerson. Emerson is the fucking worst ever, but Lovecraft will weave these crazy spirograph patterns with his words and talk about things in weirdly abstract, removed ways. It actually makes his nonfiction very interesting because he's very articulate. But in his actual stories, there are times when it just gets kind of fucking annoying. Like, okay, Lovecraft, we get it. One thing about Lovecraft, you will learn some new words if you read him. My favorite is sepulchral, which I learned means relating to a tomb or interment. Thank you, Lovecraft. So, all in all, my feelings on Lovecraft are a lot of people's feelings on Lovecraft. He is a key figure in modern fiction for a very, very good reason. His writing contains some very powerful ideas that deserve to be remembered and disseminated, but the actual act of reading him was not nearly as valuable as the sentiment derived. Alright, it is the next day. I am amazed at how long this is taking. Can you believe I actually thought this might be like a 45-minute video? Crazy, right? And I just fucking realized I almost missed the most important part of the Lovecraft thing, which is my favorite story from it, fucking Cellophase. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but Cellophase. This story was absolutely incredible, immediately became one of my favorite stories, and immediately became part of my self-image, kind of. Cellophase is a very low-key story. It's about this working schlub guy who lives a very mundane blue-collar existence. But he leads this double life where when he goes to sleep, his dreams follow this pattern where he keeps having these super detailed, vivid, lucid experiences where he's transported to this fantasy land, at least from his perspective, where he is essentially royalty or someone very important. And in this crazy dream world, there's a shining utopian city named Cellophase that is continually calling out to him, and in his dreams, he believes he is the ruler. And the story is this back and forth between his mundane, beleaguered, defeated existence as a nobody, juxtaposed against his dream life where he is this ascendant, spiritually empowered person. And the implication is that as he goes along, his dream life becomes far more important to him than his waking life, and he increasingly sees this as his real existence, where it's almost like the vision of Cellophase grabbed him in his dreams and is slowly but very deliberately dragging him towards it, and this other dimension of his experience is just slowly enveloping him and becoming the real world. And by the end of the story, it's somewhat open to interpretation what happens, but that's basically what ends up being the case. And Cellophase immediately grabbed me, because especially at the time when I read it, that just was my life, kind of. where I was kind of at an inflection point where this creeping dimension of my reality that had started very small was pretty well overtaking me. And the sensation of being slowly swallowed up by this other world that most people are convinced don't exist, or at least it's not something you can talk about publicly easily, that was really going on with me. It's a little weird to look at Cellophase now, because I've kind of hit the point where I'm just openly embracing that as, yeah, this is what my life is. That's not easy to explain to other people necessarily, but yeah, this is what I'm doing. But I read it when I was at sort of an inflection point in that process, where I was kind of in the middle stage of that transition, and it really fucking hit me. To the point like I literally felt, if I wanted to tell someone how I experience reality, I could just tell them to go read Cellophase, and that experience would probably explain it better than anything I could do with my own language. And at that time, I had little nubs of developing thought of wanting to do a third channel, and I just immediately fucking knew if I do make this channel, it will be named Cellophase, which, if you've been paying attention, you know. Not that much more to say of it, just a very sweet little story that captures a really specific emotion that it's hard to find anywhere else, and which has played a really big part in my life for a couple years now, really. Not everyone will connect with it the way I do, but very good read. It's always going to be one of my favorite stories, I just can tell. Alright, last but not least was The Howard Collector by and about Robert Irving Howard, and this book was fucking delightful. If you don't know, Howard is the guy who came up with Conan the Barbarian. He was an old school writer of pulp stories, mostly active during the early 1930s. He produced a very wide range of stories, mostly about manly men going on crazy adventures. The very first thing about this book, it is just so fucking fun. It's not that every story is great. Many of them are not. There's a wide variation in quality from story to story, but Howard writes with this bubbly, earnest enthusiasm, which just makes him so fucking endearing. And when the stories are good, they're just so fucking fast and interesting to read. This book is a little weird, and like I said with Lovecraft, I really got an appreciation for how the format of their fiction influenced their actual writing, because many of the works in here are very short. Several of them are literally 1, 2, 3 pages. Unfortunately, some of them do appear to be literal fragments, scenes which were intended to be nested into a larger, complete story, but ended up being isolated pieces. That's my impression at least. A few of these do just seem unfinished. And a big part of what makes Howard so fun is he just gets right into it. He does not fuck around. He is so good at identifying the core nugget of intrigue that a story has, and just fucking hitting you with it really quick. I think the best part of the book is honestly some of the poetry and the nonfiction in the rear. But of the actual stories, my literal favorite one was the very first. It's called Two Against Tyr. Compared to what's in this book, it's actually fairly long. It's about 20 pages, although the pages are pretty small. And it's this simple little action story about there's this Germanic guy who's in a Near or Middle Eastern city. There's some crazy religious festival going on. He inadvertently insults the god because he doesn't understand the custom. The people in the procession start attacking him. He escapes with the aid of some local badass who says a few mysterious things but seems kind of friendly. There's a couple action scenes where one saves the other, then the German guy goes back to bust the local dude out of prison because he helped him and he owes him a life debt. And after everything is secure, they meet up with some local friendlies, ride off into the night, and it's just the beginning of an epic bromance where you look at them and go, yeah, two awesome warrior men met up, developed a bond, and now they're off to have further adventures. This is the story of how they became friends. That was a lot of fun. A very simple emotion, but told very efficiently, and it didn't really need more of it. And it gives you insight into how Howard operates, because these two could come back at any time if you wanted to do a further adventure. But you could also just have that story by itself without reading this first one, and it wouldn't matter. And with Lovecraft, I was talking about how the fight scenes are kind of limited and kind of silly in his case. And that was something I discovered about Howard. He will write scenes where they are honest-to-God play-by-plays of fight scenes between just guys slugging it out in an alley or a prison, where he will literally just list, he went in with a left jab, and the other guy came back with an uppercut. And it's not complicated, but it doesn't need to be. And that's a great thing about Howard. Nothing fucking drags in his writing. Or if it does, It's literally a paragraph could have lost a single sentence. It's not like Lovecraft where he'll spend 3 pages to say a single sentence basically. Howard is fucking fast as fuck with progressing the main thrust of his stories, and it's so nice. Part of why I've had such a hard time reading fiction lately is just I get so distracted. I'm so fucking used to listening to words while I do other things that just sitting with a book is fucking painful to me. And it was kind of a blessing to be working through a book where some of the stories are literally 4 or 5 pages long, but they tell a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end, and then you can just put the book down, go do some shit, and come back. Howard is incredibly approachable. He is never, ever, ever going to intimidate away an audience, which is obviously the fucking case with Lovecraft, holy shit. To an extent with the Dune guy as well, but especially Lovecraft. Very clear language, very strong emotions, and the constant invocation of classic archetypes, which are simple, but again, very effective. There's a passage in here where it describes Howard's description of Conan, and there are no Conan stories in here. Conan was kind of its own thing. I get the impression that if you want to get into Howard, it's not necessarily helpful to go straight to Conan, and as of yet I have not. But when he explained his thought process of creating Conan, Howard apparently told a fellow writer that he just had lived this life of being out in the oil fields and constantly seeing these really rugged dudes. Drillers, cattle ranchers, bandits, sheriffs, fucking boxers, and local round-the-town thugs. And that Conan basically emerged fully formed right out of his imagination because he had this swirling image of the common traits of all these hyper-masculine, rugged, frontier people in his brain. And that played such a big role in his understanding of the people around him that Conan just kind of emerged directly from that. I would describe Howard as someone who gives a lot of credibility to things which can be a source of meaning. One thing that dates the book slightly and you notice a lot is Howard is very, very willing to look at family lineages, nationality, and to an extent racial origins as a source of characterization. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's never in a hateful way. It's more that Howard belonged to a more innocent time, and he himself had this openness about the world around him that I think channeled into this. In the very first story, there's this point made about how the main character is tall and has light hair, and he's obviously from this Germanic tribe, and he's from a strong warrior people. And he treats it as completely legitimate that we would look at this man, read into his background, and see a chain of cause and effect leading from the deep, distant origins of his family to where he is now. The rear part of the book is a series of letters of people talking about Howard, and in a letter by Edgar Hoffman Price, he talks about visiting Howard and driving around with him in his small Texas town, where when you went around with Howard, he would constantly be pointing to structures and aspects of the geography, telling stories and offering explanations of how they tie into the history of the area, where he'd say, oh, those houses used to be a Mexican mission, that office building was originally a fort that was affected when the American government was fighting the Plains Indians, things like that. And it gives the impression of Howard as someone who really thought in narratives, and everywhere he looked, he was looking at these very long, grand chains of meaning, tying people together and tying the present into the past. And he's someone who was very willing to capture the spirit or the gist of a pattern, rather than getting fixated in the details and looking at all the ways it can break down or potentially be seen as negative. I do not regard abstraction or simplicity as bad, and in Howard's case, it really fucking works. And beyond that, there's not that much for me to say about the fiction in the book. Just simple ideas tackled very earnestly, very efficiently, and with the intention being to tell a good story in the very limited space of the page counts. There are definitely places where Howard stumbles. His writing is not the most elegant, as opposed to Lovecraft, who is absurdly over-elegant to where the writing style will overtake the subject matter. Howard's writing tends to be fairly simple, and while that's a big part of what makes him so approachable, you will occasionally hit paragraphs where it's just, that wasn't super well composed, that was a little clumsy. In general, the energetic, fast pace of the writing works, but it's not always what the story was best served by, I think. Another thing is, Howard can be funny, but he's not super consistent. He's not Mark Twain, would be a good way to put it. A couple of the stories will build up like you really feel a punchline coming. Then the last line happens and it's like, that's kind of funny. One of his funnier stories that really did stick with me is called Ye College Days. And I love that just because the idea is so silly, where it's about this older dude who sits down next to a young college student and just starts spinning a yarn about what it was like to go to college back when he was a young kid. And it starts out like typical old guy rambling, but then it gradually transitions into this absurd situation where intersports rivalries were actually attempts by school members to fucking murder each other. And the students are running around with axes, dismembering each other and burning each other at pyres, and that was really funny. I did enjoy that. And while several of the stories were very fun, I think that Howard's poetry and nonfiction actually has some of the best stuff in here. One of my favorite things in this book is a short passage called Sentiment, where it's basically one paragraph where Howard just angrily and hatefully dismantles people who look down on earnest expression or treat the serious emotional travails of other people as frivolous and embarrassing. Especially great is the last bit where he says of these people, "He is a cheap caricature of humanity. His soul is smaller than a mustard seed, and his soul would yet engulf his brain. Poor and doubly poor, the man who from a thinness of blood and a lack of virility boasts of sophistication." And that is wonderful for a couple reasons. This has not really came up yet. I am a big fan of C.S. Lewis. And Lewis had a central metaphor for the bitchy, over-intellectual men who were, in his opinion, dismantling Western culture, where Lewis's central complaint was that he viewed tradition, sincere artistic expression, deeply held moral intuitions, and a general respect for the long-held sources of meaning that have existed throughout humanity. Lewis had a lot of respect for those things, and he had a lot of contempt for this emerging class of what he saw as pseudo-intellectuals, where they look at those with contempt and see themselves as modern men who are above it, and they see this as a manifestation of their intellectual superiority, when in Lewis's mind, it's just a deficiency in morality and deeply held emotional sentiment. And his central metaphor for these people was men without chests, where these people think of themselves as having gigantic brains, but it's really that their heart and their chest is so small that it only looks big by comparison. Howard's depiction right there was dangerously close to Lewis's, which I appreciate, and also it's just a very direct and literal explanation of the emotion that brought me to Howard. The reason I am reading this book is because Don Jolly did a video about this book, and that video is literally one of my favorite YouTube videos. I fucking love it. He communicates an emotion that I am 100% on board with, and then reading Howard and seeing him put it so well is, it's nice. Another nonfiction thing he did was The Beast from the Abyss, where he just talks about cats. And I was expecting that to be kind of a write-off. That's one of the best pieces in this fucking book. It's actually an extremely clever, composed essay that I would say is extremely fair to the cats, and even more than that, gives you some real insight into how Howard's mind works. And I think that is really the single biggest thing I took from this book is that you get a lot of fucking insight into just who Howard was as a human being, and he's a very endearing figure. If you don't know, the basic trajectory of Howard's life is that he was born in Cross Plains, a small Texas town, to very nice parents. His dad was a doctor who was traveling in the area all the time. His mom was just a very nice woman that Howard was incredibly close to. Cross Plains went through an oil boom. This brought a wave of corruption and just social decay that left a huge impression on Howard his entire life. He saw a lot of suffering and bad behavior, which seemed completely unnecessary and was just driven by the economic activity. He read a lot as a child, got into Weird Tales and other magazines, publishing his stories. He did this while living with his parents, which he did his entire life. And when he was 30, his mother became sick, and when it became clear she was not going to die, he shot himself in the head and died. But even though he never left Texas, throughout his career he had lengthy correspondences with his peers, other people who published in Weird Tales. He had a correspondence with Lovecraft, which, as I said, I need to go fucking read. And the second half of this book is mostly filled with letters between Howard and other people, or people talking about Howard in either articles or correspondence. And it painted a picture of him as a human being that I really related to. An overarching theme in Howard's life that you pick up on from this, and some people talk about it very directly, is he lived with this really contradictory duality in his self-perception, where one side of his identity was extremely masculine and extremely adult. He was a professional writer. He wrote about these rugged men who run off into the wild, have crazy adventures, develop brotherly camaraderie with the men they fight with, defend women and win their affection through chivalrous behavior. But he also had this internal emotionality where he was kind of a perpetual child. He had this incredible sensitivity, this emotional weakness. It was incredibly easy to wound him. If you slighted him even a little bit, he would hold it against you forever. He was convinced that everywhere he went, people were out to get him. He was insanely emotionally dependent upon his parents, even though his parents seem to have done a very good job of raising him. Maybe too good a job, who knows. He's described as never having really let go of his mother's apron strings. The idea of moving away from his parents never really occurred to him. And again, when he realized his mother was going to die, he literally shot himself that day. And there's a letter by his father in here, which is probably the most revealing one in a really abstract way, where he talks about how Howard had this habit of meticulously trying to structure his life so that he didn't have to encounter really painful experiences. He tells a story about how Howard had a dog when he was a very young child, who lived to a very ripe old age for a dog, but it was clear the dog was going to die. So Howard actually went into town and stayed in a motel until the dog died, calling back every day, asking his mother, "How are you doing?" And then after she answered, asking, "Is the dog okay?" And when the dog finally died, he just came back home, got back into his routine, and other than briefly asking where the dog was buried, just literally never brought it up again. Where Howard was just so vulnerable to emotional pain, he could not fucking deal with really intense experiences. Even though in his lifestyle, a big part of how he spent his time was very explicitly masculine. He constantly worked out, he drove around in his car through the desert in, gentlemanly clothing. He carried a gun with him everywhere because he was convinced that someone was going to jump out and try to kill him at some point. And given how big a shithole Cross Plains was apparently, it doesn't sound that crazy. And he just lived with this eternal contradiction of outwardly he was living this lifestyle that would imply a incredibly confident and masculine person. But on the inside, he was incredibly vulnerable and, again, really a child. And you see that contradiction play out in his correspondence with the other authors. As a quick aside, in recent months, I've gotten much more into Tom Oliver from Digi's Circle and the Procrastinators. I've been listening to his podcast, for example. I find him to be a very endearing, relatable person, partially because Tom Oliver is the only creator I have seen who is as openly down on himself as I am. Or at least in the same fucking area. Where if someone gets Tom talking, he will just occasionally be like, fuck me. And it's weird that you don't see this behavior more often because, as far as I know, a very large portion of artists are sensitive, self-loathing human beings, but for whatever reason they tend to hide it. And with Howard, it's not that extreme, but you definitely notice him doing this. There are multiple places where he just flat out says he doesn't consider himself to be a great writer, or he's at least skeptical about the idea that he's all that good at what he does. And when he's talking to his peers and collaborators, he takes a very demure, deferential attitude. It was both adorable and kinda sad. There's a part in here where he's talking to... who is it? August Derleth, another writer of weird tales who actually contributed to the Cthulhu mythos later, also involved in the publishing process of these stories. And in his letter, Howard refers to a picture that had been taken of Derleth, of him standing in a natural setting, and Howard actually compliments him, talking about how cool and masculine he looks standing in front of that waterfall, and just what an impressive, imposing image he makes. And I feel like that was a little peek into the childish inner core of Howard, interfering with his attempt to have respectful adult relationships, where that's not a crazy thing to say, but in this context, you just kind of felt Howard feeling a little jealous of Derleth and that he can't look as cool as he does. And if you look at a photo of Derleth, he's not an incredibly handsome man, but he's a very stocky guy with a really thick jaw. He looks like someone who would play a dad in an old school sitcom. And Howard himself was a pretty imposing figure, but he also had a very childish face. He had very round features and very soft blue eyes that kind of interfered with his towering badass look that he wished he had. And that comment was just this sad little Freudian slip that he put in there. And there are plenty of moments like that where Howard just says little things that imply that he's a little insecure about his place among this community of artists, several of whom he respects so much. There's a part where he makes mention of Clark Ashton Smith, who was another weird writer, who had apparently gotten into the hobby of making sculptures out of dinosaur bones. And Howard makes a comment of, "Oh man, Smith is so talented. What else can't you do? It's so crazy that this is a whole other level of you being cool that you're adding on to what you have." Not in those words, but that was the sentiment. And you can just feel Howard kind of kicking the table going, I already feel this biting inferiority against the artistic genius of Smith. And now not only is he revealing this whole other skill he has that I could never do, but it's making statues out of dinosaur bones, which is the most awesomely masculine fucking art form you could ever imagine. And you just know that Howard wishes he had thought of that and done it first. And that was another thing, getting an insight into the structure of how this little niche publishing activity worked and the relationships these people had, where everyone's kind of competitive with each other, but they're also peers who have a deep mutual respect and they appreciate each other's presence. They talk constantly. They're kind of friends underneath it all. Howard makes a comment that he has a special relationship with Weird Tales because he feels like he grew up with it, and eventually getting accepted into it and meeting these creators he really respects is a big feather in the hat for him. And then you learn that this magazine had this little inner circle of super productive contributors who were the most frequent people and just heavily associated with the magazine. Then there's an article that says R.E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, and Clark Ashton Smith were the big three of the Weird Tales magazine. And then you realize, oh my god, this is just Shonen Jump. This is just Bakuman set in the 1930s. And that's when I realized I have a deep fucking desire to see these relationships made into a fucking movie. Because that would be so fucking fun. Where the relationship between Howard and Lovecraft is so interesting and intense. And these guys were running around, making relationships with each other, meeting each other, collaborating, having these crazy combinations of interests that played off each other in very strange ways. This would be so fucking fun to learn more about. And again, a running theme with these people is them as human beings in many ways seems much more interesting than what they actually fucking produced. And I want to see these relationships. Unfortunately, one of the people becomes very prominent near the end of the book because it was fucking... there was a Weird Tales guy named Edgar Hoffman Price, and he had the very, very unfortunate distinction of being basically the only human being who ever met Howard in real life who did not meet him as a byproduct of living and working in Texas. Hoffman was traveling to Mexico, he made a detour to visit Howard, thought about making another detour that hit him again on the way back, but just went straight home to, I think, California. And not too long after that, Howard killed himself. It's almost like Price was deputized into explaining Howard to the rest of humanity because he was the only person with any information whatsoever. Except, of course, for his father, who comes across as a very intelligent, articulate man, who really deserved a much better fate than befell him. The documents near the end of the book don't get too deep into this, but there's a letter that Howard writes, basically begging his boss to actually send him his fucking check, because for whatever reason, a royalty check was not arriving when it was supposed to, and Howard was in the process of trucking his mother around to all these surgeries and medical treatments, desperately trying to pay the bills, and basically collapsing into absolute poverty as his mother died at the same time. It comes across as very sad and very desperate, and that's unfortunate because that came at a time when Howard was actually making pretty good money. His income had steadily risen for years. He was just at the point where he had all these bills come at once and he couldn't fucking pay it, even though he theoretically had a bunch of money on the way. And there's a letter where he's flat out begging his boss, please send me an advance on the royalties you're gonna owe me. I need money right now, my mother is dying. And that gets some unfortunate context in the father's letters, where he explains that Howard was kind of in denial about the fact that his mother was living on borrowed time and was essentially in a hospice situation for a decent amount of the last stretch of her life. And speaking of indirectly sad things, there are multiple stories and letters where Howard says little things that in the moment you can kind of gloss over, but when you know it ends with him killing himself, you'll look at it and go, yeah, that was kind of a red flag. And I imagine there were a lot of bad feelings among his friends and colleagues who looked at those things later and wished they had done something different. Although that is even brought up, kind of. The dad was a doctor. He was a country doctor, and it was kind of a To Kill a Mockingbird situation. A lot of the locals were so poor that they paid him with chores or food rather than money. He was a very experienced medical professional, and he made the comment that when people kill themselves, it's very tempting to constantly ask yourself, what could I have done to prevent it? Did I treat this person appropriately? Could I have stopped it? Did I miss these warning signs? And while it's impossible not to ask those questions to a large extent, there's only so much you can do and you can only fixate on it so much. Howard was obviously a lot closer to his mother, but both of his parents come across as very decent people in this, and it's unfortunate. One of his father's last letters basically concludes with him explaining that he's looking for a place to put himself to die, because he was in his 70s in the era before modern medicine had no nearby family members or really any who gave a fuck about him, and a small amount of money, so he was just trying to find a nursing home that would take him in, because he'd probably be dead within a few years. He was in his 70s and starting to go blind. The idea that he was going to keep driving around the desert to perform medical procedures was just not going to happen. Well, that is about it for Howard. One other little observation. One thing I noticed about his self-insert characters is in his fantasies, Howard often dominates other men in a way that is obviously wish fulfillment. Hearing noise on the street, I sure hope no one's about to kill me. Whenever a character is obviously based on Howard, he's the toughest fighter, he makes all the best decisions, he's this really brave, cool guy. There's a little story in here where he is literally fictionalizing himself, and him and his redneck buddies are having a chat about boxing, and one of his buddies makes the comment, "The last time I boxed, I had a match in an old abandoned ice house, and it was so hot that I almost fainted." And Howard's self-insert responds to this by saying, "Hey man, if you fought me, there would be two feints. You would feint with your left, and then you'd feint to the floor." And I had two reactions to this. One, did Howard fucking originate that corny joke about a fight ending in 2 hits? Because if so, we need to give him credit for that. And my second response was, Howard, shut the fuck up. He's literally a professional writer creating stories about him and people he knows in real life, where he's writing himself as this awesome, quick-thinking quip machine that can just get one over on his friends and be the cool, smart, funny guy in the group. when he probably was on some level. He was a smart guy, but come on, Howard, that's kind of a cheap shot. That's some fucking Nabokov shit. And that's the relationship his self-inserts have with other men. But something you especially see in Spanish Gold on Devil Horse is when his self-inserts interact with women, even if they get the girl by the end, they're very demure, deferential, and non-aggressive with women, and chivalrous in such an old-fashioned way that it makes me pretty skeptical that that would ever work in real life or lead to an old-fashioned relationship. And I'm not sure exactly what the message is there, but that disparity in how his fantasy versions of himself interact with other people, I feel like there's something important there. Well, that's it. And oh my god, even if you cut out the 10-minute break, I almost have 4 hours of raw footage. Holy fucking shit. But these are 3 books I read at the implicit recommendation of Don Jolly in his videos, and not always an enrapturing experience, but a very worthwhile one. Learned a lot and found some very good stuff in the process. There are horns honking near my house that are making me very fucking nervous. Well, neither the news nor Twitter are mentioning anything crazy going on. I'm probably just paranoid, though I should put some fucking pants on in case, I don't know, shit happens. As a concluding thought, better mention, one thing that really makes creators stand out to me is not just are they a good creator in and of themselves, but are they a good resource for pushing you towards other people who you will also like? And Don Jolly has been an exceptional YouTuber in that regards, and these books would be a great example of that. I also just read The Varieties of Religious Experience, and I have a couple other nonfiction books I got which are going to take me many, many months to work through, but a couple of them got at his recommendation because they seemed very useful. Don Jolly mentioned the variety of religious experience several times, basically in a row. And then I heard Terrence McKenna talk about it in a video like the same day, and it just clicked with me like, yeah, I need that fucking book. And I feel like I'm gonna need to read it again, but that was good as well. I'll probably talk about that at some much future time. Well, let's start editing this bitch. Hopefully a brick doesn't go through my window. And yeah, I have a very bad ability to estimate how long shit will take.